Καλησπέρα σας. Χαίρομαι ιδιαίτερα που απόψε έχουμε πολλούς φοιτητές μας μαζί μας, προπτυχιακούς, μεταπτυχιακούς, απόφοιτους και πολλούς συνεργάτες. Χαίρομαι πολύ που είσαστε μαζί μας. Dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to welcome to the Archaeological Research Unit John Bintliff, a world-renowned archaeologist who is currently Emeritus Professor of Classical and Mediterranean Archaeology at Leiden University in the Netherlands and Emeritus Professor at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. Professor Bintliff studied archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge University, where he also completed his PhD in 1977 on the history and prehistory of human settlement in Greece. He became lecturer, then senior lecturer in archaeology at Bradford University, where he taught from 1977, and then he moved to Durham University as reader in archaeology in 1990, where he taught till moving to Leiden in 1999. In 1988, he was elected a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. His research interests include the archaeology of Greece from prehistory to post-medieval times, Mediterranean archaeology from prehistory to post-medieval times, and I have to say that there are not many archaeologists who can today claim to be able to navigate through this huge time frame so well, or at all, I'm sure. Landscape archaeology and archaeological theory. His publication record is remarkable, and it would take a long time to discuss his scholarly output. Let me just say that he has published over 19 books, including Mycenaean Geography, Paleoclimates and Paleoenvironments, European Social Evolution, the Annals School and Archaeology, Europe between Late Antiquity and the Middle Ages, Structure and Contingency, The Future of Archaeological Field Survey in Europe, and the Future of Archaeology, Companion to Archaeology, Testing the Hinterland, and Medieval and Post-Medieval Greece. His latest book, which was published by Oxford in 2012, is entitled The Complete Archaeology of Greece, From Hunter-Gatherers to the 20th Century AD, proving once again his command of the archaeology of Greece throughout antiquity to the modern era. Since 1978, he has been co-director with Anthony Snodgrass of Cambridge University of the Boeotia project, an interdisciplinary landscape program investigating the evolution of settlement in central Greece, with archaeological survey of town and country as its central approach. This project is widely recognized as one of the most significant regional research programs in the Mediterranean region, and one which has greatly influenced the way archaeological landscape is studied, contributing greatly to the definition of a whole new discipline we now call landscape archaeology. We are thus very fortunate that today he's here to talk to us about the Boeotia project and how it has evolved in the 40 years since it was initiated. Professor Bintliff.
Maybe we could bring the lights? Yes, okay. Ευχαριστώ για την πιθανότητα ότι είμαι εδώ στην Κύπρο. Επίσης, ότι μπορώ να δώσω μια διαλέξη. Δυστυχώς τα ελληνικά μου δεν είναι τόσο καλά. Είναι καλύτερα στα αγγλικά. What I want to talk to you about this evening is to give some idea about the project that we have been carrying out in central Greece for actually 41 years now. I have to keep updating this, a lifetime. And I'm glad to say that one of our colleagues who's sitting on the shelf there, Professor Vionis, is watching but is unable to join us because of his wildlife in California. I think something happened anyway. But Professor Vionis has also been one of our colleagues for many years representing this institute. Just a little bit of background. Archaeologists began to think about landscape archaeology as early as the 18th century. And here you see the English antiquarian Stukely with some friends looking at monuments in the landscape and trying to see how you could put together the history of the landscape. This was very innovative, to go out and to look at monuments. But by the time we reach the 19th century, learned scholars, we call them the travellers, were going through the Mediterranean and were trying to find places mentioned in ancient texts by visiting, by picking up artifacts, talking to local people, such as Ludwig Ross. And you see some of the routes he took in Greece in his travels trying to locate ancient places. By the time we reach the period just before the Second World War, this kind of topographic research had reached such a level that actually John Pendlebury was able to record an immense number of sites on Crete. This is just one period alone that we see on this particular diagram. He walked Crete himself many times on foot. But this was work which was done on horseback or on vehicles, and we have to move to the next stage after the war, when pioneers such as Richard Hope Simpson were making meticulous maps of mainly prehistoric sites, visiting them on foot and trying to put them into the landscape and to date the material. Essentially it was prehistoric, but some recognition of later periods was carried out. But all this work is what we would call topographic or extensive, in the sense that it wasn't intended to walk across the whole landscape, but to try to pick out some of the outstanding sites and the main periods. And it's not really until we move into the 70s and 80s that we can talk about intensive survey, which means covering blocks of land completely, if possible, and to try to look at everything that you can find on that landscape. As a student, I was lucky enough to be invited to go on this project in the Ayafarango Gorge in southern Crete, which was a small valley which was studied very intensively on foot, and to be able to use that in my research. As you see, an abandoned landscape, and on the right an early image of the part of the Bronze Age settlement. The next innovation was to not just look for sites or settlements or burial places, but actually to look at all the ancient and prehistoric material lying on the surface. And this is what I'm talking about today. It's not excavation, it's complementary to excavation. It involves going across the landscape, looking for traces of ancient and prehistoric activity as you see it on the surface. The next innovation was what's called non-site survey, and this was really something we took from the States, which was realizing that as you walk across landscapes of any period of use, you tend to find that apart from sites, which are large numbers of pieces in one place, there are lots of places where you find one or two or three pieces. This is very common, and we can't just ignore this. What does it mean? It's something to do with human activity in the landscape, sometimes called the taskscape, things that are being done outside of settlements. So by the time we reach this survey on the island of Kea, you can see that this particular part of the island of Kea is actually full of artifacts. Only the white patches don't have anything, or they are settlements, modern or ancient settlements. The very black areas are sites as we would normally think of them. So this is the background to the work that we began to do in 1978 in the province of Boeotia in central Greece, that you can see highlighted. It's a large area, 2,500 square kilometers. So we knew from the beginning that we would have to sample it to take some small areas intensively and try to get a picture of the whole. What was known already? Well, a colleague of ours, John Fossey, had produced a gazetteer of prehistoric and of Greco-Roman sites. And this is one example of a map, and you can see here a chart showing the density of known sites in prehistory and up through the historic periods. So that was a beginning for the whole region. This was based on topographic extensive studies, excavation. Another useful thing for us already, and for Professor Vionis, was that the Byzantine Atlas project from Vienna, the very first volume, was actually based on central Greece and Thessaly. And this came out in 1976. And this project basically records all the monuments of the Byzantine and Crusader period, and also the texts that mention places. So this is a very useful background again for us before we began the survey work. This shows you the areas that we have covered in these 41 years. We have stopped doing active research into new sites, but we are revisiting sites and doing other forms of research still. And so we show you here the ancient city of Haliartos in its countryside, Thespiae in its countryside, Hietos in its countryside in the north of the region, Tanagra in its countryside, and then just the city site of Koronia. So through this, using different windows, we wanted to try and get the overall picture of developments in this large, important region of central Greece through all the periods, from prehistory up to the present day. Now, how do we do this? Rural survey first, landscape survey. Well, you find yourself a team of students. This is quite an old picture. This gentleman here is now an established professor. He looks very different from this in the British Museum. A team of students, and you field walk. That means you go across the landscape, fairly close intervals, eating grapes, I see, but you're also looking on the surface for bits of broken pottery, bits of lithic, building material, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you might actually see some architecture, but usually it's ceramic, which is very resistant to decay. So this is the work we do field to field, and by the period you see up here to the late 80s, we were covered a very large area in our first survey area around Haliartos city and Thespiae city, and you can see the individual bits of land, the transects, that we had done this sort of intensive survey. And an important feature about this was, in those days, just a manual clicker device, a little thing that used to be used on aeroplanes to count passengers, and we used it to count bits of pottery so that we could look at the density of material as it rose and fell, usually marking the high points were sites or burial places or some special place of activity, but in between there was a lot of this so-called off-site material that we wanted to record and try to understand. And the method that we've used really, and we've been happy with all these years, was to walk across the landscape with our team of students, counting pottery and looking at density, and then if we find ourselves on the edge of a large collection of material, to close up and to break up into small units and to study these units. So the site here would be studied in a grid, and then from that, looking at density from hot, very high, to low, very low green, you can see the shape, in this case a Roman villa site, and you can see the core of a Roman villa and the outer buildings. And then here we're in the sort of rubbish areas or edge of the activity zone, and then we're back in the open country. So that's how we try to get a picture, finding the sites and looking at the material between sites, and then how we would then use this material, because it is then carefully placed within a grid, so we can look, as you'll see shortly, at changes across the site. Because in fact, very few sites in Greece are single period. They often are occupied in more than one period, and if you just think the site is static, it's only one size, you're almost always wrong. So only if we are able to look at the different parts of the site individually could we see if the site got larger or smaller, and what different periods and what different activities might have taken place. This first area we published some years ago. The first volume of the project was the southern hinterland of the city of Thespiae. And here we see a map of that area, and the city is here. And as we see, there are a number of sites, these little white dots. There are 17 sites in this area. It's not a big area, but there's a lot of stuff lying about, a lot of this off-site material, which is also filling the landscape at often quite substantial densities. And we were most influenced by a former colleague of ours, Tony Wilkinson, a geoarchaeologist, who put forward a theory based upon his work in different countries of the Middle East, that when you get very large amounts of material across the landscape between sites, then it may well reflect a process of intensification. When the population rises and you've cleared the landscape, then you might find that actually you're having a bit of a problem getting fertility from your crops, because without modern fertilizers, gradually the soil gets more and more tired, and so it's very difficult to keep the fertility unless you have a very low use of the land, rotation, other crops. And so what he noticed was that in certain periods, high population periods, you can find these very widespread areas of broken pottery spreading out from settlements. And he argued this was artificial rubbish disposal from the settlement, bringing all sorts of debris, including broken pots, into the field, and it's very resistant to pottery, but all the nutrients are taken up by the plants. So often we can't find the nutrients, but we find the inorganic material. So we were keen to test this proposition. And what's interesting about the city of Thespiae, the ancient city, is that if you date all this rubbish lying around, surprisingly, almost none of it's Roman, which you might have expected. The Romans are pretty busy in this landscape, and even more busy the late Romans, but very little of that is late Roman. Whereas if you date the material to the classical Hellenistic period, suddenly the map fills up. So it does look as if this is a very special thing. It only happens in one period in this landscape. And we also looked to using computer technology, geographical information systems. We calculated, or my colleague Phil Howard calculated, what is called a cost surface, which is the time it takes to get from the city into the landscape, allowing for distance, but also hills. There's a lot of hills around this area. And this is the cost surface. So this is pretty easy to get down here, but this is dark stuff is getting a lot of steepness or distance, etc. And when we calculated all this pottery that we felt was being taken out of the city and rubbish dumped into the fields to make them more fertile, we found that by and large there's quite a correlation between the ease of movement with your carts and donkeys full of rubbish and where most of this stuff is deposited. So we have argued that in this case and other cases where we have immense amounts of continuous pottery, this is probably the reason that Thespiae city in the classical Hellenistic period had a problem with fertility of its crops, and they began to cart their rubbish out for a long period and spread it in the fields to try to keep them fertilized. And in fact, this happens to be the period when the city is at its maximum. The largest size of the city is exactly the period when this happens. And as we shall see later, when it drops off, the city has already declined. Now, I've told you there's a lot of stuff. There's so much stuff lying around this city that if you go to these areas immediately around it, the fields look like this. This is pottery. None of this is an archaeological site. This is just rubbish spread out. As you see, it's a very even surface. It spreads out like this, but there's no focus at all. So this is a none site. It's actually created by rubbish immediately dumped on the edge of a city. So I won't go into the detail, but we had to invent some very complicated ways to try and prove we really had any sites, because every field looks like a site if you're not used to this sort of material. My colleague Božidar Slapšák at Tanagra city, I said to Božidar, could you walk out away from the city and tell me when the pottery stops? And after a kilometre, he said it didn't stop. What's happening? He said he'd never seen anything quite like this before. I said, this isn't a site, don't worry. This is actually all this rubbish that's been brought out of the city of Tanagra. Now, I said before that what we can do, because we do this gridding of sites, is that we can actually trace the cultural biography of the site. And it's so important to realize that so few sites in the Mediterranean are just one period. And unless you can take apart the site into little pieces, you might be mistaken to think the site was always very big or always very small. So in this case, you can see how it works. Quite close to the city of Thespiae is a site. And this is a large classical Hellenistic farm, this period of high population when the city was very big. But when we get to the early Roman period, we think it contracted into a much smaller site. Then we also had late Roman material, but it's very small and it's rather not in any very clear focus. And we think probably by the late Roman period, it was actually a shed or some kind of dump for people working in this particular area as a focus for cultivating some fields. It's really essential to do this in order to be able to get this cultural biography. And then, of course, if you put them together, by period, you can trace the history of the landscape much more carefully. Now, this work, right up to 89, when we were still working in this first area, showed something very dramatic, but you can see some big stories. So we talked about the flourishing of the city, the flourishing of this manuring, and you see now that we have a massive classical Hellenistic occupation of the landscape between Thespiae city and Haliartos city. But when we move to the late Hellenistic, early Roman period, things are not going well at all. We've got massive abandonment or very little activity at many of our sites. And then in late antiquity, which as you know in Cyprus is after the fall of Rome, so late Roman begins with the fall of Rome, not always recognized in the west of Europe, I would say, but 5th century, 6th, early 7th, we see there is some revival of parts of the landscape. So we're beginning to see some interesting big trends that survey can give you, because it covers areas and you have many, many sites to get a bigger picture and to try something quantitative. Now, this is what we had been doing for quite a number of years, and we put off dealing with our city sites. We were trying to think of how do we deal with the cities, because we knew they were going to be quite a big problem. But once again, I'm afraid we borrowed our methods from America, where many of these things had been looked at, survey had been well advanced before we had developed Mediterranean survey. And the example we took was a very famous example, the pioneer survey, from the enormous city in Mexico of Teotihuacan, the biggest pre-Columban city. And a marvelous pioneer survey had been made by Milon and Whelan in the 60s and 70s of this gigantic, massive city, and they had gridded it. They'd done things we couldn't do, which was actually to do all sorts of excavation and other things that we couldn't do because of the complication of mixing excavation and survey. And they did some wonderful pioneer computer work as well on the density of different artifacts. So this was a real inspiration to us as to how we could try and deal with our cities. So if we move to a Thespiae city, after having done part of the countryside, we decided to hit the city. And we found that using this method from America, we could actually make some good progress. And roughly 1 square kilometer was surveyed in large units of 50 by 60 meters over 2 years. And it went well beyond the boundaries of the actual city. So we could see the edges and then focus on the interior. And the city focused around a late Roman fortified castro, a fortified enclosure from late antiquity. Now, one of the big problems with this work is that a city like this has a very long history. Only when you begin to study it in detail, you realize what you've got on your hands. So this city begins in the Neolithic with a tell, a magula, and it goes right through the Bronze Age, it goes right through the early Iron Age, through classical Roman to middle and late Roman. Oh, it doesn't stop. No, it goes into the early Byzantine and middle, the late Byzantine, and it goes into the Ottoman period. And finally, the site is deserted about 1811 AD. The last people recorded by that famous traveller and spy, William Leake, about 1811, the last families were leaving the site. So we've got everything, but we study it all on the surface. So can you imagine, we've got this 1 kilometre, and in front of you is pottery and bits of stuff from the Neolithic, the early Neolithic, up to 1811. So this is a fascinating but quite problematic concept in that all this stuff, and you see the other next problem is that it comes in different numbers. So the prehistoric is not very well represented. Most of it's lying deep and it's been brought up for other reasons. The Greek and Roman is better represented, and not too bad is the smaller occupation. But there are some periods that are very poor. So we have a lot of problems if being able to tell the story of these thin bits, to make sure they get their voice. These people get a voice. We don't forget them. And we've had to do all sorts of games to try and see how we can extract the story of these periods which aren't so well represented. Well, this is the density of the city, and we can roughly say now that the city stops here in these light green colours, and then it focuses, the densest bit is the late Roman fortification, the core of the late Roman city. But there's a lot of stuff in here. There's cemeteries, there's activity areas of all kinds, and of course the city didn't keep the same size. So the city's like a small rural site. This isn't one city, ever. This is a number of cities, and actually not only that, villages before and villages afterwards. It's all in there somewhere. Well, volume 2 of Boeotia was the city of Thespiae, and you can see how we did it in that book, which came out 2017, but I'll just give you a few highlights of at the end what we come out with. For example, through most of the Neolithic for several thousand years, everybody was pretty well just living on the Tel Magula by a stream with some fertile soils here, and they hardly did anything as far as living except living on this focused little part of the city. So that's an interesting contrast. The first village for several thousand years is very confined in space. Well, here's the classical Hellenistic city, the time when the city was at its maximum, 70 hectares or so, 10,000 people or so were living here. But there's a lot of things in here, so we have to try to break that down, and that's how we can do this. We can decide from all sorts of different methods that we have the cemeteries around the city, we have an early city wall, then we have an extension that took place somewhere in the 4th, 3rd century of the city. And that's the classical city. And then we have the contraction. The city shrinks into a much smaller size in the late Hellenistic into the early Roman period, and we have a lot of good evidence from also some sporadic excavation from tombs we can find from the type of pottery, so we can get an idea about this, comparing this picture to show the shrinkage of a city just at the time when they stop manuring. All this stuff in the countryside pretty well disappears. The city is much smaller. They don't have a problem of feeding themselves anymore. After the city collapses in late antiquity, we believe that a village survives right through the early Byzantine period. And it becomes much clearer by the middle and late Byzantine, and I'll just show you a picture of the late Byzantine or the Crusader period, when we have two villages here on the edge of the city over former cemeteries. And we can define here the sort of core habitation, an inner area, probably intensive farming, and then an outer area where they're doing a little bit of this manuring, I think, trailing out here into their inner territory. And this village will continue, as I mentioned, into the 1811. And that's the book which came out 2 years ago, where we explain how we try to understand this beautiful, complex site through all these periods of time. Now, till recently, we were actually relying on very primitive methods, which was actually to pace the landscape and to use compasses. And at a certain point, I'm glad to say, we were able to move on and to use computer technology in the field. And this is my colleague Bart Norderfleet, who actually has a little palm-top computer here in his hand, and he's got a little GPS receiver on his head here. So it means he can actually record very easily all those little transects we do in the landscape, and put them very accurately, however irregular they are in the landscape, onto his palm top, and on the palm top he can record each detail of each of these units. So this has been really, since the turn of the millennium, it's been a great revolution in speed and accuracy. So when we moved to the city of Koronia, the last city that we dealt with, everything was very much easier. So we could set out our little grid over the whole city of 20 by 20 meters. And this is the picture we're able to, in 5 or 6 years, to cover the whole city. It's only about 35 hectares, rather smaller than Thespiae, and you can see the grid that we could lay out to try and look at the history of the city, again from the Bronze Age up until the Middle Ages, when it was deserted. The idea of having these little small units was to try to see if we could pick up households in the period where the city was most expansive, again classical Hellenistic. And we did find in the majority of our grid units, these little boxes, that they were domestic areas, and we could pick out things like beehives, grinders for grain, weaving equipment, and tableware, storage vessels. So we could get that picture of households, and we're just hoping as we work through this large city that we can actually try to look at differences across areas of the city, poorer, richer areas, some specialization. So that's the plan for the last city that we will be publishing. Now, this kind of project involves many other specializations. So, for example, pollen analysis. This is Oliver Rackham, who some of you might have heard of or know. Timothy Gregory, again, some of you might know him. And Margaret Avedon, looking at the vegetation, and this is an attempt at a core in one of the bays. Soil analysis. So it's very important to look at the way in which sites relate. This is Thespiae, this is the landscape we've been talking about, how they relate to different soil features, changes over time, preference for different parts of the landscape. Anthropology. This project is so old that my wife, who's here, who looks just as fresh as she was then, but this little boy is now 39, our son David. So anthropology, Cliff Slaughter, who was our first anthropologist, now Hamish Forbes is working with us on studying the evolution of life in the villages. In a way, our project is so old that we can look at 2 generations of life, and we can go back to Ernestine Friedel's study of Vasilika, which is in our region now, to the 50s. So we can go from the 1950s to the 80s to now and look at changes in the life of our villages since the 1950s. So Hamish Forbes is involved, the anthropologist, with looking at this process of change in the contemporary period. Geophysics is very important to survey now. It's a way of cheating. We don't excavate, we look below the ground without destroying anything. And we were lucky, because I was at Bradford University, that was already a centre of geophysics, that we could bring people like Chris Gaffney and other specialists to do geophysics on our site already in the end of the 70s, the early 80s. And this was an early example of what you can do with a small classical farm site. We've got the tile, we've got the pottery, but now we have a small building with a little enclosure, 2 rooms, so we've got some idea. This is a very small farm, this particular classical farm. This is something bigger. This is a late Roman villa, and the density of pottery again is from red high to low green, and you see the shape of the site on the pottery. Then you see there's a very big complicated villa building running underneath this shape, and that's something we're working on publishing at the moment this year. Of course, for cities, because many of our cities are not in cultivated land, we can do well in terms of getting some wonderful geophysics in good situations. This is the city of Tanagra. This is the work by our colleagues from Slovenia. And this was grid planned, probably also in the 4th century. And you can see a very perfect picture of the city. And some details. You can see the street plans, the insular plans. And there are other features which we can look at in a minute in terms of the early Christian landscape. So there is actually a big cathedral here, and up here there is another basilica, and this shows you one of the late Roman basilicas. The grid is running north-south, so this is running out of the grid here. You can see the apse and the different aisles of this late Roman basilica. And in fact, more recently, the Eastern Atlas, a German team from Berlin, has shown that this city is much larger than we thought it was. It was always believed this was the ancient wall. It turns out this is only a late Roman rebuild, and the city is actually 2.5 times larger from these samples. Quite embarrassing, actually, but there's so much pottery it would be difficult to find the edge because of this manuring problem. So we got the geophysicists in, and lo and behold, the city is not just here, it goes all the way down to here. Some very important information. And most recently we've had the pleasure of the very famous and important Apostolos Saris, who's worked with us at Hietos city and also at Haliartos. And this is his diagram of the geophysics of Haliartos city, showing a Hellenistic city destroyed in 2 days by the Romans, and it's like Pompeii, so it's just as it was left. Only the Acropolis was used again in later times. So this is a frozen Hellenistic town, and he's fitted the geophysics of the town onto the contours, so you see how the city was built onto the shape of the town. One more thing that we have been working with over the years is other methods of research. This is geochemistry, which means looking at the soil to see the traces of kind of human pollution. Where people live, you have a habitation effect. You have a build-up of trace metals, heavy metals in the soil due to all sorts of rubbish and things we do. So if you go away from London, you find that there is pollution stretching way out to many kilometres, affected by aerosols, by pollution in the air, but also by human activity. So we thought we would see if we could get some results by taking soil samples from ancient landscapes. And here's an example of a large classical farm. This is the density of pottery. There's the core of the site is here, the centre of the farmstead. And here's the geophysics. So we have a 4-room building. We have ditches defining the edges of the farm. But then we have a massive amount of lead in the soil. Lead is a very common contaminant from human habitation. Then in the ditches we have some phosphate, which also is part of decayed vegetable matter, all sorts of human debris. Now, I mustn't forget ceramic studies. We rely absolutely on a team of very highly skilled professionals who have to get to know the local ceramics, because it now turns out that at least in Greco-Roman times, most pottery was made in the region or even at the city that we're dealing with. And we're lucky to have Dr. Philip Bess, who works on our Roman pottery, and I just want to give you something which was published in our last book on the city of Thespiae, which was the source of the Roman pottery at Thespiae. And as I've just said, the majority of the pottery at the Thespiae city came either from the city itself or from its immediate region. We get things all the way from Spain, from North Africa, from Egypt. We're getting imports, but they represent a very small percentage. And this kind of work, which now can actually try to source the majority of pottery, is really fascinating and important, because at last we begin to get a grip on the connections of a site with the outside world quantitatively. How involved are they with exchange, trade, with movement of goods? And we can begin to get some serious figures because of the moves that have been made by people like Dr. Bess for Roman material, by Professor Vionis for looking at medieval and later material, and actually being able to trace the source and quantify this. So this does bring us into the medieval and the post-medieval period. And let's look at the example of Tanagra to see the kind of things that we can try to work on in this period. So Tanagra was a city that we studied, one of our 5 or 6 cities, and here it is. It was abandoned in late antiquity, in the early 7th century, and then we were lucky through a survey to find what happened next, is that this site, Castri, appears to be a late Roman, early Byzantine fortified village on a very strategic position. So here we have this very special material from the 7th, 8th century AD, the time of great disruption or movement of people into the landscape. And so the city was abandoned, and we're lucky to find one of the refuge sites where people hung on, survived behind fortifications in these early troubled centuries. But by the time we get to the 9th, 10th centuries, when the Byzantine Empire is re-establishing, taking control again, we find people abandon these fortified sites and they move into the open country. And we've been able to find all these small black dots. These are villages, hamlets from the Middle Byzantine period onwards. And here's an example. Just below, this is Tanagra city, and immediately below it is one of these Middle to late Byzantine hamlets by a church here. And this is Professor Vionis' chart showing the material from this site of Aios Tomas, and you can see here that it's really rising to a peak in the transition between the Middle Byzantine and, in our area, the Crusader period. Then, like most of our sites, it's abandoned in the 14th century because of all sorts of problems. And it's really interesting that the kind of pottery you find is exactly what is portrayed on contemporary icons, particularly these footed but ring-based bowls. Now, the next image shows one of the most interesting sites from the Crusader period, from the 13th and 14th centuries. We have a fortified tower of a Crusader lord, and below it is a Greek Byzantine village that it controlled. And our colleague Peter Locke mapped these Crusader towers throughout Boeotia, and they nearly all mark villages which were the basis of the food and control of these incoming feudal lords. They are small feudal keeps. Now this site, the M4 in the Valley of the Muses, was quite a small Greek village during the time of the Crusaders from our survey. And that's roughly how big it was below the tower site there. But if we move into the period when the Ottoman Turks took control of our landscape, things change quite dramatically. 15th century Greece comes under Ottoman rule, And luckily, we suddenly emerge into texts. We have very good text archives, the Defters, which give us very accurate pictures of Boeotia. And this is a map I made with the help of our Ottomanist, Professor Makil Keel, showing the villages of Boeotia in the 15th century. And we know the ethnicity, Albanian, Arvanites, and we have Greek villages as well. And we have the size. And you see here that we have Panaia, this is the VM4 site, is a reasonably large Greek village. It's a refuge village from this period, whereas the rest of the landscape, which has been deserted because of the Black Death and warfare in the 14th century, was being refilled with Arvanitic Albanian colonists, lots of these little white circles. After 100 years, by 1570, things are really taken off. As a result of the Pax Ottomanica, the creation of peace in this landscape, relatively low taxes, this landscape really takes off. So you see the population has risen, much bigger villages, denser landscape, and our village is one of the biggest ones of all. It's a gigantic village, Panaia. Well, some people say, can you believe these Ottoman tax records? Yes, we do, because when you look at this site, that's exactly what you find. We would estimate that about 1,000 people lived in this site, and actually that's pretty well what the tax record says, about 1,000 inhabitants. So this is a really big flourishing village. There it is. And this is the tax record by Professor Keel, and you can see the evidence of the population rising. You can see we've got wonderful stuff about wheat, barley, sheep, wine, cotton production, so you can do a lot of interesting things, and actually in a minute I'll show you what you can do with this kind of economic information to go with a surface site of a deserted village. In fact, Panaia was so wealthy in 1466 that they built 2 monasteries for themselves, and they constructed 13 watermills. And these are not just little watermills, these are big boys. This is the best surviving one. It's about a 70-meter canal leading from a spring down to an overshot watermill. Now, Professor Vionis has been playing with our data, our survey data, and also with these Defters, and he published recently a wonderful study focusing on this site, Panaia, we've talked about, but another deserted site which was a surface state at Chiflik, Ginosati over here, and he compared these 2 deserted villages. Firstly, we have houses, so we know that people are living in these very traditional macrinaria, these long houses. This is the VM4 map. And this is the Ginosati, again, the long houses. And here we have a konak, which is the overseer's tower, because this is a surface state, it's not an independent village. Now what Professor Vionis did with this was to look at the ceramics from these 2 villages, the VM4, the big, healthy, happy village, and the rather depressed serf village of Ginosati. And what a contrast. You can see that the happy people of VM4 are getting loads of imports from Italy, from Iznik, from Turkey, and from other parts of Greece, whereas the impoverished people at Ginosati, lucky if they get something from Athens, but most of it's very locally produced. There are other differences in terms of quality, in terms of a variety, and of course we have the tax records showing they have different economies. So for me, this is a whole new horizon that Professor Vionis is opening up, where we can talk about the differences between individual villages over time, the economy, the social organization, and we really can get the evidence and begin to test this elsewhere, but use this information where we only have the archaeology, we don't have the text as well. Now, another, I think, very important part of our project was one of our students, a great friend of Professor Vionis, Lev Sigalos, for his PhD, tried to bring together the history of domestic housing in Greece. And this is a book he produced in 2004. And it's a really useful resource because it describes the different types of houses. And these are houses which are surviving in the landscape, or they were till recently. And it's very important to look at the Venetian influence on the islands and on Crete, to look at the Ottoman influence in the areas where the Greece only later on took in northern Greece, and so many Ottoman buildings survive better. These green ones are the most interesting. For us, this is this kind of traditional country house of the lowlands of south-central Greece, these long single-story houses, such as we've just seen on our deserted villages. And of course, this got us very interested in recording these. We realized that hardly any were surviving. Nobody lived in them. They still were hanging on in villages. So we began a project to record standing buildings, ruined houses, before they were destroyed. And here's an example from near the people of Koronia moved out of the city in the 14th century and moved to a village called Ayos Georgios. And we did manage to find, hanging on, just a few traditional houses in this village. So we were able to record them. This is Professor Vionis helping us here recording. This is a double macrinaria, a longhouse here. Animals and people living in the same house. This is a house which actually hung on. It was destroyed last year, about 1820. But luckily, we had done something. This is what happens next in the villages about 1890, 1900. Wealthy people in our villages begin to build townhouses, or imitation of townhouses, a very important development manifesting itself. And again, these are mostly in ruin, so we've been recording these as well before they go. But they're all going to go any year now, I think. And our colleague Chiara Piccoli, an expert in virtual reality, was recording, also reconstructing these houses in 3D for us with typical furnishings. And this is a picture of a longhouse. You can see the animals and the people are together here, and they're eating off a little low table, which still you can find sometimes in the old houses, still surviving. This is a wonderful photograph. I'm so glad to find this in the Photothèque in Paris. Sorry, Photothèque, the French school in Athens. This is one of our villages. This is the village of modern Thespiae. It used to be called Eremokastro. It's about 1890. And you see everybody is living in these long houses here. And I love this picture, this couple wearing their traditional dress. And I realize now every village has its own dress. This, if we could see it better, this would be different from the next village. There'd be some distinct feature. And this is some of the things we learn from ethnography. You really need to think about in archaeology and to think about the implications. That there are way people living in the same houses with the same pottery would still be different from the people living over here in the next village. This is a Greek village. We think the people from Thespiae actually moved here. Descendants of the ancient cities, we think some of them were here. This is an Arvanitic village. It's called Leondari, but it used to be called Zograkobyli, and we know it was founded in the 15th century by colonists invited by the Ottomans to repopulate the landscape, and we were able to publish the defters from here and also the records from here. This last picture raises a final point, which is today very important to us, and probably when we started we weren't so aware of this, which is to try to relate what we do to the local communities, to try and connect with them. I remember that we were putting pottery back in the Thespiae Epophyki, and a man went by on a bicycle and said, "I'm a school teacher here. Where is our city? Where is it?" And he didn't know where the ancient city was. And I thought, well, this is a big gap in knowledge that the school teacher doesn't know just below the village is the ancient city. He didn't know that. So, you know, it is a really big gap, particularly in the country in Greece, because people are still mainly learning at school about Athens and Pericles and the Parthenon, but they don't know what happened in their own area because it's not so spectacular. And of course, this is also a complicated story because these are some of these people are Arvanites, so they have a different history. They don't have a kind of Greek history anymore, but they are part of the Greek story. So it becomes very complicated. So how can we try to connect with local populations and bring what we do, history of the countryside, into their awareness, not least because it's so difficult for the Euphoria, for the Ministry of Culture in Greece, to cope with the amount of work they have to do for actually controlling destruction. So in order to try to get beyond this, to try to look after sites, present them, it's very, very hard for the money. So in many ways, local communities, villages and towns will take a larger and larger role in trying to protect the landscape and to educate children about their own antiquities. And this is happening. I'm very aware in many Greek villages there are small organizations, clubs, where people are collecting information about the local community and are finding out what's being published and are presenting themselves and creating their own particular local history. And colleagues of ours, Eleni Simoni and Kostas Panagiropoulos in Patras, have been doing a lot of work with schools in Greece, trying to make packages, local history packages for schools, to actually help children to find about their own past in their own countryside. So this is really moving, and we've got to try and do more, increasing what can we do about this, basically. Well, I'll give you an example of a kind of problem. One of the problems is that most of the things we find on the surface are not interesting for people to come and see. So a lot of pottery lying there doesn't mean a lot. You can't see very much about it. So it's very difficult to actually make these sites exciting. They're not like Delphi. Of course, lectures are local communities, and we've often asked, probably like most archaeologists, can you talk to us about what you do in the village square, in a local museum, and actually explain things to them. And secondly, we've been looking at virtual reality to try to bring sites to life. This is an example of how this works. This is Koronia city, and at the bottom of Koronia city there is a Frankish Tower. And in fact, it marks the fact that when the city was abandoned, a Byzantine village was founded at the foot here in the lowlands, and at a certain point some crusader lord came along living in the great palace at Thebes, and he said to some knights, you can have this village, go and build a tower and bring in the crops and the animals. So the lord went out from Thebes, the great palace, and he built his little tower here, and a Greek Byzantine village was below it. And there's just a little bit of his tower left, only one face of it actually. Now, the villagers who own the site, Agios Georgios, who we think are partly descendants of the original community, they learnt in the late 19th century that they had a city of Koronia near them. Unfortunately, the name had been given to another village because nobody was quite sure about where Koronia was at that stage, so it's called Agios Georgios. But they knew gradually that they had an ancient city. It was in their land, it was kind of their ancient city. But when they went there, you can see almost nothing. This is one of the few things you can see of a city, and it's not actually ancient. It's as we've said, it's Crusader. But in 2009, the mayor of Agios Georgios built a monument as you enter the village. It's a very good imitation of the Crusader Tower. But of course, the people didn't know the date or what this was. They thought it must be part of the ancient city wall. Very understandable. So they built a bit of the Greek city wall to commemorate the fact they were aware they had an ancient city. I think they would be a bit disappointed if they knew it was actually the horrible Crusaders who came in and took over. So we haven't told them yet about this. But I mean, the more important point to me is they wanted to have a past of their own. And I'm impressed they did this, because they say, we have a monument, we don't know much about it, but we have something which is ours. And actually, I think it's very likely that they are the descendants of the people who used to live below it. As far as we can see, the movement coincides with the foundation of the village. And we know it's a Greek village from the very first Ottoman tax record. So what can we do about that, apart from we have given lectures to the village? But one thing we did is to try to give them their city back, an invisible city, to make the city visible for them. This is how the site looks. It's beautiful. You can't see anything, but it's a wonderful place. This is actually the village that was called Koronia. It's nowhere near the ancient city, and it's actually Arvanitic as well. It's actually not Greek, but still. And our colleague Chiara Piccoli did for her PhD a virtual reality reconstruction of the city at its height, the Hellenistic period. And this is how we do that. So we take the contours of the hill, recording it, and then we put on top the archaeological survey. I showed you earlier the grid with all the material of different periods and our division of space into religious space, domestic space, the agora, public space, cemeteries, and so on. And from this, we can build up this picture using our understanding of what Greek houses would be like. And we have the orientation of the houses. We know that from the geophysics and from the architecture that lies on the surface. So the idea really is that we can create this, and it has been done now. The PhD work is done. This exists, and you can navigate it. You can explore it on a laptop. You can travel around inside this ancient city, And what we're going to do this year is to try to bring it to the local schools so that the children can actually explore the invisible city, and there are bits that they can connect to with our help when they go to visit that. Thank you very much. Or just general questions from everybody, please. Don't be shy. Bernard, you must have something to say.
I don't have questions, I only have a comment.
Yes, please. Yeah.
The work in the city surveys is something that we never even considered doing because it was so complicated, as you say. And so it's really impressive to see how this works, and now how you are trying to develop that to make it more meaningful to current residents. So I can only applaud you for this part of the project.
Thank you.
Who wants to make a question or a comment?
That's an amazing project, obviously. How many people were actually involved? Because it's quite a long span. And how do you manage all these periods and all these the breadth of the material? It must be quite a large interdisciplinary group that is working. And how has it been changing through time?
Well, when we began, my colleague Anthony Snodgrass and I, we are prehistorians. So our interest was to fill in the prehistoric picture intensively, but of course, obviously, to look at the Greek and the Roman periods. But then we were really amazed that there is so much medieval, post-medieval. I think the real revelation came when we had Professor John Hayes was working with us, who is was a walking encyclopedia, and we had a lot of material, and he could look at everything from the early Iron Age onwards to late Roman. And then he began to say, well, this is 16th century AD and this is 17th century. I said, you couldn't do that? Oh, I said, you can? Wow. I thought, this is really amazing. I didn't believe that because many surveys just said post-Roman. You know, everything post-Roman or had glaze on it was kind of, that's it. And I just didn't know that. So that was really a revelation to us, and we thought we could do this. And then luckily, Professor Bionis came along as a PhD student, and then he began to become a specialist in his own right and to take this, as we've seen, much, much further in detail and move into these social and economic aspects. And then, of course, we realized that these deserted villages had houses on them because we're not, architecture. It's a lot of work having architecture. Sherds are okay, most buildings, okay, we better do something about them. And then they're still there. Look, this village has still got one of them. So we began to think, well, we should do something about these houses in the villages. And then there were these towers, which were out of a context. Are they watchtowers? Are they something to do with roads? And then because of a survey, we realized, no, there's a village by every tower, almost. So we better find a village. So then the whole field of deserted villages became important. And because John Hayes had told us, well, we can date this. And then Athanasius had been able to say, we can do even more with these sites. A whole field of post-Roman archaeology developed. So in a way, when you do landscape archaeology, you cannot reject anything and say, well, I know there's this building here, but we can't do everything. You know, we just leave that, and that's impossible. Who else is going to come back and do it? And as we've seen, these are disappearing. So if you don't look at this old house next year, it's not there anymore. So a whole tradition has gone. Nobody even remembers that life. Whereas now you could find old ladies who lived in long houses, and they can tell you a little lady in Ais Georgios was still living in the long house, and she brought out, I've forgotten the name, this little table. What's the name for it in Greek? This tiny little low table they eat meals from, and she brought it out to us. And we just see this in the pictures like this, and she still had that from the 1930s. So it's on the edge of disappearing, actually. So we began to feel, well, and to do that then we have to bring in more people, prehistorians, the Greek and Roman pottery, the medieval pottery people, the post-medieval pottery people. And then you find that the material is mostly local, so it's not in any books. You know, you cannot use a book from Athens or Corinth and say, okay, it's like this. No, it's not like that because it was made here. So you have to build up a local collection of pottery, of fabrics and types. And from the fabrics, you can now begin to find where things are made, not just for style. And that's a whole revolution, really, is fabric analysis. So we can begin to really move away from just styles and dates towards economics. So gradually these things unfold. And I'd like to say we should have published it all earlier, but in a way, had we published it all earlier, I'd be very embarrassed now because I would not agree with this, because if you do it too quickly, of course we published a lot of articles, but now the final books, we change a lot of things because I realize I would have made many mistakes by being too quick and coming out with a quick result. And then now we look, oh, there are things I couldn't explain. The data's you see it like the city data, you know, you've got millions of bits of pottery. It's very complicated to think about how do you understand the fact that some of these are present almost in tiny numbers, some are overwhelming, and how do you actually see the picture of life in these periods? And it took years to try to think of a methodology to deal with that. As I say, to give a voice to the people of each period, not just the Romans who are shouting at you, we're here, we know you're there. What about these poor people from the late Hellenistic or the early Byzantine? You know, they're very almost invisible, but give them a voice, these people. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Stella, sorry.
Yes. Thank you again. Thank you for the presentation. And I was impressed by this large percentage of local pottery
Yes.
that you had.
Yes.
That's very important. Have you located kiln sites, and have you found any pattern? Because it must have been, I mean, the local production must be large.
Yeah. Yes. No. We don't have big excavated kiln sites except at Tanagra, been excavated by the Euphoria. But interestingly, that's on the coast, and the people of the city inland weren't using those as amphorae. So that's also important to know.
You mean the late Roman too?
Yes. Yeah. So we have different late Roman to the ones at the coast, but we have most of our cities. We actually have large collections of waster, of dump material from production, and they made most things, including decorated tablewares, and that's very important. And we've been able to trace cities which are sending pottery to neighbouring cities, and how far that goes, how important that was. But you know, the vast majority of material is made within the region, and a large percentage at the sites themselves. This big 16th century village was making glazed pottery, for example, you know, which it's a big enough market. They could also make some nice things themselves. So
Its settlement had its own kilns, or there were areas with good soil and other raw materials that they were specialized through the ages. I mean, they.
We think most Greek cities, Roman cities, made most of their own pottery. Hietos is a volcanic area, and it's very difficult to make pottery from the soil there. And it has a very distinctive volcanic temper, so they made rough things, that they couldn't make anything fine. So they had to bring in a lot of pottery there because they didn't have good clays. But we were very struck by, you know, this dominance of local production, including things that look as if they should be imports, but they could imitate many of the styles. I think particularly this revolution in or being able to look at the fabric material also using these optical computer microscopes, so you can very quickly see the section on the screen and then take a photograph, send it to somebody. You know, that's really speeded things up, and having a big collection for comparison. But it's a revolution, I think, from dating towards actual economics that we can, not me, but our specialists can do for us. So it's a very important field. But it really means you have to collect, you know, you really need to set up a very good local collection of fabrics and types, because if it's true most of this is local, you can't rely on anything from outside as a guide to date. You have to get your own materials sorted out, basically. Yeah. Maria.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I'm wondering, how many years now have you been using the depters, and where did you find them?
Yeah. Since about 1990, with Professor Keel, who was one of the people. There's a small group of wonderful people who can actually read these extraordinarily difficult documents. So they are in Ankara, they are also in Sofia. They're very dispersed. He told me a story that at one point, I think in the 1920s, a trainload of waste paper went to Bulgaria, and when it arrived, somebody noticed that it was the Ottoman archives, and it's sold off cheaply to Bulgaria, and luckily instead of pulping it or whatever, they kept it. So a lot of material is actually present there as well as coming out, but every year it comes out randomly apparently, so you don't know that your village or your town's going to appear, and then one year suddenly, you know, the record appears. So there's lots to come still, and there are many copies. That's the advantage. So it's not just one copy, luckily. So there's a chance that almost all the empire we can get records like this. But I think for archaeology, as David Clark said a long time ago, for prehistorians as well, to be able to see the relationship between these texts and the plans and also the material and the way of life is wonderful, to actually see, well, how would we test in a prehistoric period what's going on when we don't have these records, but we have these correlates as Vanassis has showed. You can actually look at villages and begin to put the pottery together with the animal bones and the seeds and the location and the houses, and say something about lifestyle differences between communities. And here we can test it because we have the records telling us actually really what was happening in these communities, and maybe use that as a model, I hope. Yeah.
So they actually give you quantities of produce?
In the early period, yes. In the 15th, 16th centuries, they were very, very detailed, and it seems pretty accurate. You don't have to make allowances. With the decline of the empire in the 17th, 18th centuries, things were not so accurate. So you have to make correction factors for the things which are missing, and we don't, very often we don't have the economic record, we just have population figures. So we lose this. Occasionally you get these other details, but by and large, the later period, we don't have. And then by 1800, travellers like Pugville are travelling around collecting material, so we get lists again of products, but there's a gap between about 1600 and 1800 where we don't have, unfortunately, unless you happen to be in a place where the wonderful Venetians came. And then, of course, you can get that again, even with maps of fields. I mean, fantastic material in the Peloponnese and elsewhere, where you can get compensatory evidence from this period of land use and population, and even more, you know, maps of villages and maps of fields, which we never have really. So, but in the gaps, we're still missing those periods. Yeah.
If I may ask you, regarding pottery, are there specific fabrics that have been used through more periods?
Yes.
And, did you have some arguments among your specialists
Yes.
who all wanted to have some fabrics for their
Yes, there are a few fabrics that appear at different intervals. So it's important to build up a whole assemblage of shapes and to look at small differences to see if you can do that. But it does mean quite often the specialists walk around the room with a shirt saying, do you want it? Can I have it? To actually get that. And there's a big, I think particularly our early Iron Age to classical specialist wants to steal all the prehistoric pottery because he believes that it's been neglected because really there's a lot of, it is true that the early Iron Age and the Archaic period is a problem in many areas in Italy and in Greece. I don't know whether here as well, but it's a real problem is to recognize material in the early Iron Age and Archaic period. And some of it may go into prehistory, some of it goes into what we call geometric to Hellenistic, which is something to do with the Greeks, you know, and it disappears. And his argument is that it needs to be found again. So he's constantly sneaking, trying to get Calliope Sari's prehistoric sherds and telling me they're not yours, they're really mine. So there's a bit of a running battle there. But it is true there are big problems in some periods where we know that we're not seeing the material, you know, and we're only seeing the beautiful pieces from cemeteries. So there's a big gap in some of our periods, and we really have to, like the early Byzantine, we know there are more people in the landscape than can be picked out by the obvious types of material.
Yeah. Did you have a permit to collect all the material, surface material?
We had a permit to collect material. The problem came that there was a point where because some of the Ministry of Culture archaeologists don't do survey, they had the idea that we collect everything. In fact, there's nothing left, including the city, which must have 15 million pieces. So they had a kind of, well, maybe you're taking everything away. So we had to put the statistics, which is, so we have a thing called the sample factor now, which we work out, and it's always less than 1% is ever collected from what's there. And then next year there's more usually. So it's not really, but more problem is where to put it in the museum. So we do have a bit of a storage problem actually. So yes.
Are there more questions? Definitely a survey, either extensive or intensive surveys of great importance, in particular nowadays that we all see all these extreme natural phenomena, heavy rains, etc. Sites are getting destroyed. So the contribution of landscape archaeology is immense. And of course, landscape archaeology is not as expensive as an excavation, unless you are doing a lot of geophysical prospection,
Yes.
prospection, etc.
I think you get a reduction now. Professor Saris is coming here. You get a special price.
Thank you very much for this splendid lecture.
Thank you for the invitation. Okay.
All the best for the next volume.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everybody's invited on Wednesday, where we have the presentation of the book edited by Yoros Papadimiou and Thanasis Bionis. Professor Bintliff has taken over